Hello everybody, and welcome to Bread Garden Market's third edition of the Wine Cash Club. Today we're going to be doing the alternative tastes of Italy. So we're going to be focusing a little bit on lesser known regions and lesser known grape varietals. Just kind of have fun with things people may not be as familiar with Italian wines. For Italy, as in other regions we've done in the past, this is pretty difficult. The question with where to start when we're talking about Italian wines is a difficult one, just because Italian wine is such a general, vast subject matter. Italy and the importance of wine and the Italian culture cannot be overstated. For a lot of Italians, wine is like a condiment. You find it at the lunch table, you find it at the dinner table, you find it with just about every meal. So like we use ketchup or A1 steak sauce or mustard, they use wine, and not for sometimes for cooking, but most times for drinking. And that's not unusual for European culture, but France and Spain, you find similar things certainly. But for Italy, it seems like the Italians always take it to another level. Now, in the United States, part of our own lack of understanding of Italian wines has to do with our lack of exposure. If you go into your standard grocery store, most of them have, 10 to 15 Italian wines maybe. Most of them are covering 4 or 5 Italian wine regions. You'll see Piedmont with your Barberas or Dolcettos or Moscato d'Astis. You'll see wines from Tuscany, like your Chianti Classicos. You'll tend to see wines from Abruzzo. So a lot of stores have Montepulciano d'Abruzzo as well. And then Veneto, where a lot of your Pinot Grigios come from, Valpolicella, Amarone, things like that. So it's actually a very small sample size of what Italy has to offer. Italy is just vast. We could spend 300 videos talking about Italian wines, Italian wine regions, different types of varietals, and we'd probably still only scratch the surface. So Italy has, just to kind of give you a ballpark, Italy has 20 recognized wine regions or wine areas. Now within those 20, again, there are many different sub-regions. So where Tuscany is a wine region in Italy, or Piedmont is a wine region in Italy, if you go deeper into those regions, you get Barolo, you get Barbaresco, you get Langhe, you get Bolgheri, you get Montalcino. So the 20 regions of Italy that I'm talking about is very broad. And then like every other country, every other winemaking area we talked about, there's a lot of subsets within those 20 areas. Italy has over 800 grape varietals. So every nook and cranny of Italy, literally every nook and cranny of Italy makes wine. It's the largest producing wine country in the world. Occasionally they would go back and forth with France on that title, but the Italians have pretty much owned that, at least for the last 5, 6, 7 years, maybe longer. Italy consumes more wine than any other country per capita. And again, them and France go back and forth, but the Italians pretty consistently have the top spot, and if they're not in the top spot, they're one of 2. So again, going back to the importance, going into how vast and important wine culture is in Italy, you're talking about a fairly small country that produces the most wine in the world and drinks the most wine in the world. So, the Italians know what they're doing when they come to wine, and have for thousands of years. And wine culture in Italy predates the Roman times, predates Greek settlement. As a matter of fact, when the Greeks first settled Italy, they nicknamed it Land of the Vine, because so much of the continent they were settling was covered in vines. Although, I guess over the years, the level of quality we've seen here in the United States from Italian winemakers and Italian wineries has actually fluctuated quite a bit. You know, in the United States specifically, wines from Italy definitely went into a kind of a downtime or downturn, especially when you're talking about the 50s, 60s, and 70s. If you talk to people who were drinking wine back then, when they thought of Italian wine, they thought of those Chianti bottles in the wicker baskets that restaurants would use to hang off of their ceilings, or they would use them as candle holders. And that was probably a better use of those bottles than sticking the kind of wine that they were putting in there. Most of the Chianti that was in those wicker baskets was not all that great, and that's putting it mildly. A lot of them tended to be very fruity. Some of them were kind of weirdly astringent and overly acidic. You know, think of Gallo wines now. That's what some of those were. But Italy has come a long way in improving their wine production, and kind of consolidating and just catching up with the rest of the world in terms of the kind of quality they're exporting. That has a lot to do with the rise of the DOC and DOCG. When we talked about France, we talked about the AOC, that governing body that sets the rules and laws that govern the requirements and breakup of Italy into different wine regions, what grapes are acceptable in those wine regions, how many liters per hectares of wine can you make to label it X, Y, or Z, how long something can be aged in barrel, how long something has to be aged before it's released, et cetera, et cetera. And despite problems that Italy still has with administrations and with governments, and red tape and all that stuff, there does have to be credit given with how far they've come. Italian wines here in the US, in terms of what we get from Italy, has expanded enormously. And Italy is truly among the heavyweights in terms of great wine producing countries of the world. Of course, you could find great wines before that as well, but you'd have to go to Italy to find a lot of these. A lot of families have been making wines for hundreds, even sometimes thousands of years, where you have continuously active vineyards. So before kind of the 60s and 70s, what we're talking about in the US, there was great wine in Italy, but the consistency and the overall improvement in quality has just grown tremendously over the last 50, 60 years. So what are we covering here? So because Italy is so vast, and because the Wine Cash Club has a kind of certain theme to it, I thought this would be a good opportunity to explore some of the different regions of Italy. And I'm really only talking about two here, but the first region we're going to explore with the first two wines is Emilia-Romagna. Now, Emilia-Romagna, somewhat surprisingly, is not well known as a wine region. It's actually, at least here in the United States, it is the food epicenter, the culinary epicenter of Italy, though. And, you know, again, if you said that to a Sicilian or a Piemontese or someone from Tuscany, they would, you know, probably give you a backhand for saying such a thing. But gourmands around the world and food historians do kind of recognize Emilia-Romagna as the food capital of Italy, and rightfully so. Other regions have fantastic dishes and can argue a lot about their own particular regionality of cuisine, but Emilia-Romagna, we're talking about the birthplace and home of Parmigiano Reggiano. We're talking about Prosciutto di Parma. We're talking about balsamic vinegar. We're talking about the land of pasta. You know, think about your lasagna bolognese. And then, you know, every single town in Emilia-Romagna has their own version of lasagna bolognese. And each town makes the best, whoever you talk to. And that's one of the great things about Italy, is the amount of pride people take, not only in the wine, but certainly even more so sometimes in the food. Think about like tortellini and brodo, the fantastic tortellini dish that's in this super broth, whether you've had it there or there are lots of versions of it here in the US, with some great high-end Italian restaurants usually have that on their plate, or that giant ravioli with the nice soft egg yolk that comes out, also originated in this area. So Emilia-Romagna is kind of the epicenter of Italian food, at least historically speaking. So you would think then that they make a lot of wine, and they do. You just don't see as much of it here in the US. Of the 20 regions in Italy, the 20 broad regions, Emilia-Romagna actually is fourth in terms of production. So it's surprisingly high. Just a lot of it isn't imported, or I should say exported, but imported into the United States. The wine from Emilia-Romagna most people are familiar with is Lambrusco. And Lambrusco, you know, if you're grew up in the 70s and 80s, or drinking wine in the 70s and 80s, the Lambrusco you're probably most familiar with is Riunite. Used to have those Riunite on ice commercials. And kind of Lambrusco has gotten this reputation as this kind of sweet, red, bubbly from Italy. In fact, Lambrusco can range from sweet to actually very dry. And Lambrusco is probably the national wine of Emilia-Romagna and the one most well-known worldwide. But the better producers, some of which you can now find here in the US, and especially over in Emilia-Romagna, is nothing like a lot of the Lambrusco you've had throughout your life. In fact, Lambrusco is one of the top wines that people from Emilia-Romagna will drink with charcuterie, especially prosciutto di Parma, with the various cheeses that come out of that area. Because it's bubbly, and we've talked about in other classes how bubblies go great with food because they kind of carbonic, the carbonation kind of cleanses, is a natural palate cleanser. But then the red fruit, especially on the drier Lambruscos, go beautifully with prosciutto. And even if they're a little sweet, a little sweetness also goes really well, because then you have that like interplay of like salty and sweet. And that is an amazing combination too. If you've ever done like a prosciutto, we do a sandwich here on the weekends with prosciutto and a little brie, and then we put like fig jam on it, and it's that, again, salty sweet. It's fantastic. So a good Lambrusco is an incredible wine to pair with food. But Lambrusco aside, Emilia-Romagna makes dozens and dozens of other wines, and they grow a lot of Sangiovese, which is probably the most important or well-known red varietal in Italy. But they also grow things like Barbera. They grow Montepulciano. They grow Bonarda, not the French Bonarda, and not usually the Bonarda you see like in Argentina. So there's a tons of wine producers. There's There's lots of vineyards and great wines from Emilia-Romagna. And we're actually going to be trying two of them today, both of which I'm a huge fan of. We're not going to try a Lambrusco. There are great Lambruscos out there, and if you're interested in kind of setting a tasting up and want to do a cool pairing with Lambrusco, we have great suggestions at Bread Garden Market. But this we wanted to do, again, alternative stuff, so we're not talking Lambrusco. But we do have a really fun, sparkling white, which is on the drier side, which is just a field blend of a number of different grapes, which we'll get into in a second. And then a really cool blend from there that I've only kind of discovered in the last couple of weeks. So let's dive into those. Our first wine from Emilia-Romagna is from Leonardo Bulli. And a couple things here to point out on the label. It says underneath here, Ortrugo dei Colli Piacentini. Ortrugo is actually an ancient varietal. It's a grape varietal you find in Emilia-Romagna. That makes up part of this blend. Emilia-Romagna is actually one of the oldest wine producing regions in all of Italy. The grape varietals, a lot of the older grape varietals date back from like Mesopotamian times. The settlers from Mesopotamia actually brought grape vines to this region. It's really incredible. But some other grapes in this particular wine is the Uva Samponnina, which is known as Marsanne in France. There is some Moscatel or Moscato. There is some Blanquette, some Santa Maria, Ortrugo, which I mentioned, and Malvasia. And then there's a few other varietals in there as well. So some of them native to Emilia-Romagna, some not, but they do have a number of those ancient varietals in there. The other thing I would kind of point out in here is the Vino Frizzante. Vino is just wine, of course, but Frizzante is a particular style of sparkling wine. So Frizzante is just lightly sparkled. So anytime you see Frizzante, it's lightly sparkled, as opposed to Spumante, which is fully sparkling. So Spumante wines would be more akin to champagnes in terms of like the amount of bubbles, the amount of CO2 that's trapped in the bottle, where again, Frizzante is just slightly sparkling. But they do make this in a similar way to champagne. They do ferment, for example, the grapes as a dry wine in the winter, and then they'll seal it. So basically, your wine will be kind of sealed like up to the beginning of the neck here. They'll cap it off, and then they'll sit in the cellar till the spring, and then they'll give the wine a dosage. So basically what they do is they'll put some fruit juice in there. Basically, essentially, all they're doing is putting grape juice into the bottle, sealing it again, and then what happens is that grape juice is sugary, so you'll have a secondary fermentation that takes place. And because the bottle is sealed, there's no place for the CO2 to escape, so that's why it becomes sparkling. And they do the same thing for champagne. This is not a Prosecco. In Prosecco, they do a little different style. That's more in the northeastern part of Italy. So we're not talking Prosecco here. They do what's called the Charmat method in Prosecco, where they'll do big vats of wine, and they do something similar, but here they're doing the dosage, the secondary fermentation in the bottle. And so that's most of the relevant information I have. So again, popular sparkling in Lambrusco in Emilia-Romagna, is Lambrusco, but they make a lot of nice other sparkling wines as well in Emilia-Romagna. So this is fermented dry initially. It has a little bit of fruit from that dosage, but this is a drier style Frizzante. So it really smells nice. Don't swirl. I have a terrible habit of swirling. You don't have to swirl your sparkling wine. It agitates the bubbles, and that's not recommended, but I swirl my coffee in the morning. I cannot help myself. So a little honeyed, a little almost tangerine, apricot. Really nice. Minerality is too, good acidity. Has a little bit of fruitiness, not sweet at all. Again, this is dry, but does have a little nice fruit up front. But it's that acidity and that minerality really balances out this wine nicely. He's growing this particular wine comes from a vineyard site he has that Leonardo Bulli has. That's about 12 hectares, so not very large. And it's all limestone soil. So when you're making great Riesling or Sauvignon Blanc or Champagne or any kind of great sparkling wine, like chalky limestone soil is typically the best. They tend to give you that nice acidity and minerality inherent in the grapes that you want in these particular wines. So, and this is, as we're getting into the warmer weather here, as we're rolling into spring, hopefully it gets warm again here in the next couple of weeks, this is just a perfect porch sipper. It's wonderful. If you wanted to pair it with food, a soft goat cheese would be excellent. A nice, light, simple salad. Shellfish, do some clams or shrimp. This would just be perfect. But I would just throw this in the cooler for a few hours in the refrigerator and just sit on the porch or on the patio and sip away. Enjoy. So our second wine, also from Emilia-Romagna, that we found a little bit off the beaten path, actually literally 2 weeks ago, is from La Stoppa Winery. This is the Trebbiolo 2019 Vinho Rosso. Now, this is a blend of two grapes, one that people are probably familiar with, Barbera, which is found in a few places in Italy, but certainly most likely to find it in Piedmont, but they do grow some Barbera in Emilia-Romagna. And Bonarda is the second grape. We're going to get a little confusing here for a second. Bonarda is a very well-known grape, but Bonarda is actually two different grapes. So you have two genetically distinct Bonarda grapes. So you have Bonarda, which they think originated, one type of Bonarda which originated in, they think, France, in particular the Savoie region, and that kind of migrated down to Piedmont. So it's also called Bonarda Piedmontese. In France, it's called Douce Noir. And then a lot of that Bonarda got transported to the United States. In California, where it's known as Charbono. And then certainly in Argentina, they actually grow, and in different parts of South America, they grow quite a bit of Bonarda. So Douce Noir, Charbono, Bonarda, Bonarda Piedmontese are all different names for this particular grape. None of them are related to this Bonarda. This is Bonarda croatina, which I think comes from the area in and around what we now call Croatia, across from the Adriatic. It came over, and Bonarda croatina you see in Lombardy and Emilia-Romagna. Interestingly, although these are two different grape varietals, so Charbono could mean it comes from Croatia or Emilia-Romagna, Lombardy. That's one varietal, and the other varietal is all over California, parts of South America, still a little bit in Piedmont, although a lot of it in Piedmont got wiped out during phylloxera, and still a little bit in France. Again, phylloxera wiped out a lot of those grapes. So even though these grapes are distinctly and genetically different, they both kind of serve the same purpose. In Italy in particular, it was almost always used as a blending grape. Bonarda is kind of warm, soft, lush, low in acidity. And so especially in Piedmont, even though it's a different type of Bonarda, they would often blend the highly acidic, kind of gruff Barbera grape with the Bonarda grape. And the Bonarda grape would kind of soften the high acidic tones of the Barbera. In Emilia-Romagna, they do the same exact thing with their Charbono. They tend to blend it with higher acidic grapes, and it'll kind of balance out the harshness, in this case, of the Barbera. So really an outstanding blending grape, no matter what species of Bonarda we're talking about or where it's from. If you ever have 100% Bonarda from California or the Emilia-Romagna or Lombardy region, they don't taste that different. They make wonderful wines, and at least for Italian varietals, unusually they're low in acidity. Sangiovese, Barbera, Nebbiolo, all have fairly high acidic content, or they're grapes that are high in acidity. So enough about the confusing Bonarda talk. Let's get to the wine. So it kind of pours. It's a nice ruby color. Ooh, it smells really nice. A little earth and spice. Really nice. I get that nice lush red fruit. Wow. So you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. And you get a little bit of tannic structure from the Barbera. There is acidity there, but that Bonarda really softens it up. This is really lush, warm. I'm still tasting it. Excellent finish. The taste is still going. Sign of a great wine, by the way. One of the two most important factors of great wine is its balance. But in terms of you want wines on another level, it's finish. You know, if you sip a wine and before you take another sip, you're tasting it 20, 30, 40 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes later, that's a sign of a really well-made wine. And I'm still tasting this, and now it's kind of developed a nice, almost kind of green olive flavor to it, but really pleasantly so. Wow. So, the first time I tasted this wine, like I said, literally 2 weeks ago, I thought it was outstanding. I still, yeah, it's excellent. I'm happy to see that I am right. In terms of what I would pair this with, I mean, it's got enough body to hold up to a nice pasta with meat sauce, but also be fine with like pizza. Be really good with like a burger, skirt steak. Wow. Well, I hope you enjoy this as much as I do, and 2 for 2, off to a really good start. So our last wine is a real treat. We're moving out of Emilia-Romagna, and we've enjoyed our time there, and we're now moving to the Dolomite region. So think Alto Adige, think Südtirol, and specifically the Dolomites. So we're in the mountains now, really far north in Italy, and the grape varietal we're going to be tasting and talking about is Teroldego. Teroldego is a varietal that, as far as I can tell, has its origins in this region, in the Dolomites, high in the mountains, and it's still grown mostly in those regions. There are other parts of Italy that grow Teroldego, and interestingly enough, in the south, you see some Teroldego grown in Puglia, Sicily, and it kind of makes in a lot of ways it makes more sense there. It is kind of a late ripening grape and does tend to like the warmer weather better. So some might say its natural place of origin should have been in southern Italy or some sort of other warmer climate around the world, but it does produce stunning wines up in the mountain areas of Italy as well. And they tend to be very different stylistically between the two regions, as you might imagine. Teroldegos that come from Alto Adige or the Dolomites area in Italy tend to be full-bodied, a lot of flavor, but also elegant. So they don't tend to be overly tannic or astringent. They have a ton of flavor, but tend to have this real beautiful elegance to them. Whereas the ones that are grown and produce wines in warmer weather tend to kind of be big, bold, sometimes a little bit fruit bombs. They lose a little bit of their balance in warmer weather to my taste. So, but Teroldego is not a grape you see in the States very often. Very few producers export over here. So I was thrilled to know that there's a local distributor who carries probably my favorite producer of Teroldego, Foradori. Foradori is a family name. Elisabetta Foradori took over the winery in her early 20s when her father, unfortunately, died at a fairly young age. She had to take over the winery. So she's been making wine. She's actually about my age. So she took over the winery in her early 20s and has been doing the winemaking for 25 to 30 years or so now. Her children, who are now grown up and older, do a lot of stuff in terms of growing the grapes, helping out with the winemaking, and also kind of marketing. But Elisabetta Foradori was the driving force behind the kind of cultish following that Foradori has. I mean, when I first started in the wine business, Elisabetta was kind of a shooting star. You know, people who loved. I was lucky enough to work at a shop that really looked after those hard to find small producers who were making outstanding stuff, and we always carried her wines. And she was always spoken of, even in her 20s, with such high esteem. Even back then, she was very much super focused, perfectionist, in all the best possible ways when it comes to winemaking. And she kind of retrained all of her vineyards and vines. The farm and the vineyard is 100% biodynamic. It's a natural wine. As a matter of fact, this is the Stopa. This is the second natural wine we've done. The Barbera Bonarda wine is also considered a natural wine. And I guess we'll take a second here. You've probably heard these terms, or this term, a lot, especially over the last 5, 10, even 15 years. What exactly is a natural wine? So natural wines are, there's no set designation, but typically they're reverting back to old traditional ways of making wine. For the most part, natural winemakers are not using any pesticides and herbicides. They're all hand harvesting their grapes, typically whole cluster fermentation. Typically grapes are either organically grown or biodynamic farms. In Elisabetta's case, she is biodynamic. And typically you use native yeasts. So you're using native yeast cultures that you find in the vineyard to ferment your wine, whereas a lot of other people use kind of commercial or store-bought yeast strains. So kind of in a very general nutshell, that's what natural wines are. Natural winemakers, or winemakers that practice this type of winemaking, typically add very little sulfites or no sulfites to the wine. So for people who don't like to drink wines that have high content of sulfites, natural wines are just right up your alley. Are natural wines better than non-natural wines in terms of quality and production? No, not necessarily. It depends upon the winemaker. It depends on where the grapes are grown, how they're grown. There are great wines that are not natural, obviously. There are great wines that are made that are natural, and there is a lot of crap out there that's both. So it's just a style of making wine. Sometimes people will say natural wines tend to be a little more sour. That's not always true. I mean, people think of like kombucha or naturally fermented beers like sours. The Bonarda Barbera blend we had earlier, for example, was nice and lush and fruity. There was no sourness to it whatsoever. When you get a good wine producer, the wine is good, whether you're talking natural or not natural. Different in process. One might appreciate tradition and also preservation a little more, but taste the wine, see for yourself. That's the best way to do it. So let's get into the Four Odori. Like I said, I've been drinking this wine for such a long time, and it only recently came into Iowa. I guess maybe for a couple years now. I rediscovered it maybe 5 or 6 months ago. So the wine's kind of a nice deep red, kind of purplish at the core. Okay. So a lot of nice fruit in there, not overpowering though. So really kind of what I expect from the Four Odori Teroldego. Beautiful fruit, a lot of flavor, but again, it's so unique. Again, we talked about great winemaking and the finish. In this case, we're going to talk about another aspect of great winemaking and balance. Sometimes it's hard, like great Pinot Noirs or this Teroldego, how you're able to cram so much flavor and depth into wine and it still maintain this kind of super elegance. And part of that has to do with her winemaking philosophy in terms of letting the grapes sing. Let the grapes cook. Let them do their thing. If you have a superior product, we're going to use as little manipulation as possible from getting the grape from the vineyard into the amphora. They're aged in amphoras, aging vessels. So this is beautiful. I really just love this wine. I pair it with anything from pork to roasted chicken. I wouldn't do this with the red meat. It has enough flavor to hold up with some less fatty red meat, certainly, but it's just so elegant and beautiful. I would kind of pair it with lighter dishes and lighter fare, or I would just drink it by itself. If you want to do it with the cheese, I would probably go mountain cheeses, honestly, like a nice Fontina Val d'Aosta if you want to stick with Italian, or a Gruyere, or Comte, or Cantal, or Beaufort, or something like that. But this is great. This is kind of the ringer of the 3 wines you're going to get this month. All 3 were fantastic, but Foradori is really special, and like I said, has this kind of cultish following, and with good reason, because they're just superb wines. So enjoy the Terra del Dego. These have kind of been fun and unusual wines. I've really loved picking out the wines this month, and we'll see you again next month.